Hi, everybody. Want to welcome Wendy Peloquin. Wendy is going to talk to us about Esri's utility network, a quick dive into the water utilities portion. So those that work in the utility space should be quite familiar with at least the terminology with the utility network, and she's going to give us a really good presentation on what that is for water utilities. Take it away, Wendy.
All right, good morning, everybody, and happy GIS Day. I am Wendy Peloquin. I'm a Senior Account Executive at GIS Inc. And thank you for joining me as we're going to take a quick dive into the utility network for water utilities. So Esri, as you all know, is updating network management to meet current and future IT practices. The utility network is really going to transform how utilities manage their networks. The UN offers improvements over the present network management practices, and it's really designed to take advantage of modern IT infrastructure and services architecture and work across all platforms and devices, whether you're in the field or in the office. And really one of the other big benefits is that it's going to improve real-world representations of your network assets. And of course, the other thing that we're going to cover today is really, what you'll need to do to move forward. So building a roadmap, planning your technical implementation, content migration, implementing all the technical foundation for it, and perhaps most importantly, preparing all of your current users. So industry sources indicate that over the next 5 years, utilities are going to undergo more change than they have in the previous 50 years. Billions of dollars are being spent in smart grid infrastructure for power. And similarly, expenditure trends are occurring in the water industries. As you probably already know, Esri released the Utility Network Management Framework to production in 2019, and that has now moved into just the utility network. And really the big thing is it's not just a version change, it's really a transformation in line with broader industry changes. And so it's a technology modernization effort meant to bring modern IT best practices into the network management. Its primary going to be distinguishing characteristics or service-oriented architecture and having business logic embedded within the database and cross-platform support. So, definitely as it's moving forward, there's going to be a lot of benefits in what it's going to do. And, as we all know, ArcMap is no longer going to be supported in a couple of years. So making that transition to Pro, we highly recommend that organizations start planning for that, especially because it is going to be required for editing in the utility network. And so really the utility network also brings the capabilities to model, edit, and analyze these complex network systems across the entire ArcGIS platform. Most of the advanced functions of the geometric network were limited to the desktop environment. So that's definitely not the case with the UN. And the UN also introduces a high fidelity data model, allowing more granular and more accurate capture of both the linear and vertical assets. And these can be captured using containment and associations, which will allow for some more advanced tracing and not cluttering up your map, especially when you zoom in to those very close areas. And so, of course, the geometric network has served us all well for 20 years. The UN is expected to provide the technological foundation for, over the next 2 decades as well. So one of the big things is we know that modern workflows are going to require mobility. Common devices like the smartphones today weren't even around when the geometric network came into place. And of course, it's also designed to support functionality across the entire Esri platform, whether that is the desktop, web, native apps. Really looking at it's truly any device, anywhere, at any time. And this is going to be enabled through service-oriented architecture with ArcGIS Pro, ArcGIS Enterprise, the feature services, and geoprocessing tools. So one thing to think about is this services architecture matches efforts across other technology best practices you probably already use every day, such as such as your banking. And so, network management is going to follow a lot of those same methodologies. And of course, as I mentioned, the high fidelity data model is going to allow for more granular and accurate real world representations of the assets with very explicit connectivity rules, asset directionality terminals. Managers and operators can expect the data to function like its physical counterpart during the analysis. And finally, with all of the rules, Esri is trying to make it hard for users to make bad data. There's business logic that is embedded in the database with configurable levels of tracing and 3D support for those vertical assets. And so really, this is the next generation of network management. And so a lot of organizations we've talked to are sometimes still struggling to understand the full magnitude and impact of implementing the utility network. In one way, we've kind of, I'm sure a couple of you may have seen this analogy before, is really kind of compared, moving from the flip phone to the smartphone. Really with that, converting to the geometric network and utility network is very much a transformation, a technological transformation, not just a data conversion. So, when you were using your flip phone, you had a number pad, you might have text using a multi-tap process on, the numbers. So, you might have had to hit 447 to get GIS. And, on the smartphones, you can type away with the keyboard and it's also touch screen. On the flip phone, you may have made some simple phone calls, maybe had a couple of simple apps like a calculator, a couple of card games. The smartphone, you have a full app store. Access to camera, email, web browsers, multiplayer games, and location-based services. So in the old days, you had to call for pizza, either look it up in the phone book, memorize, dial it or memorize that number. And today's smartphone, you can easily open up an app, place your order, watch the status of the order, watch the delivery driver as they're coming to your house. So, definitely a lot of changes there. And then, of course, everything on your flip phone was stored physically on that SIM card. Now with cloud storage and services, you're now able to sync across devices and across platforms very seamlessly. So transitioning work that you do on your smartphone, maybe to your tablet or your laptop, and that information instantly being available to other connected devices. And finally on the flip phone, there were simple contacts. You might have had a name, maybe a couple of phone numbers, addresses, thumbnail photos, but the smartphone, you can actually enrich a lot of that data. So adding in addresses and social media accounts and relationships. So, the database migration that's required for implementing, the UN, think of it kind of like that, enriching that contact and the contact data. And so another big point I do want to make, though, is that while the database migration is part of the process for implementing the utility network, the conversion is also going to enrich that data with new capabilities that were not possible before. So, that's a big piece, is it's not just simply a database or data migration. And there are a number of resources out there to help compare the specific technical differences between the geometric and the utility network. We've even gone through some of them in previous webinars at GIS Inc., and those are available for free on our website. But, really, the geometric network, most of the use today, like I said, it predates, kind of the analogies we're looking at with a smartphone. And, now we're really trying to modernize and align utility management with the modern technology best practices. So as I mentioned, the utility network is really representing a technology shift, and it's not the traditional data model migration. That's probably something I'm going to continue to mention throughout the presentation. But the geometric network, there was database capability. Utility network is really more of a software product. The geometric network, you could get database level access. You're doing post data editing quality, data quality checks. Utility network, you're going to be utilizing services-based architecture. And one of the other great benefits is just being able to check the your data and make sure that you have confidence in it before you're going in and doing editing, with being able to get that set up directly, those checks. So really improving the quality of the data and what's being entered into your system. And of course, with the utility network, it is a centralized deployment. And, really just kind of going from a basic geometric connectivity to, explicit geometric and logical connectivity, and being able to really, enrich that analysis that you're doing. And, the geometric network, you were able to do the traces and, on that existing network. But now with the utility network, you're also going to be able to support those sub networks. So being able to go a little bit more granular in those network traces. So implementation of the utility network is a substantial effort. Transitioning, no matter the organizational scale, we've really determined that it's generally going to follow the same progression from an initial assessment and preparation phase through final testing and deployment. So the pathway is going to remain the same, while the magnitude and the complexity is going to be different depending on the organization. So, data workflows begin with a data readiness assessment, wanting to, make sure that the present state of your data is going to, it's clean, it's edited, the quality is fantastic. And that's going to be a huge piece of, moving into the utility network. And that's one of the things that you can start doing today and looking at the data, even if your project may be a few years off. So kind of with the data readiness assessment, you can go through, see what changes need to be made, start making those changes or some of those business decisions. And of course, with that, it's going to be an iterative process of continuing to review your data, update your data, look at the quality, and adding in, especially as you add in new data. And so, the database design process is also going to look at data mapping, database builds, migration tool configurations, and that initial testing. But, within a lot of the more technical workflows, one of the big things is doing a readiness assessment. So evaluating the state of your present architecture and your business system integrations, and resulting in those recommendations for a final architecture design. So that is one of the big things I do also want to stress, is that there will be potential changes you're going to need to make to your underlying infrastructure to be able to support the utility network. For some organizations we're working with, it might just be adding an additional server or two, but one of the big things is also setting up a test environment that we highly recommend. So once you're, kind of moving through the data assessment, the technical readiness assessment, we generally do recommend beginning the implementation with 1 or 2 pilot projects. And that's really to just kind of focus on that initial data migration and those build errors, and, how you're deciding to configure the utility network, and if there's any schema adjustments or workflows that need to be made. And, throughout the way, we also, recommend starting staff training very early in the process, just to make sure that they, understand what's happening. And when you do go live, they're ready to jump in and really hit the ground running. And so once you've, gone through, completed a couple pilot projects, you're going to be moving towards that final implementation. And once you get everything live in your environment, finishing up any other end user training, and really just continuing to move forward there. So just, one thing to stress again, the data workflow, it's an iterative process. It's going to be something that you're going to continue to do, but also something that you can start now and start early as you prepare. So a couple big questions for getting started. As I mentioned, your infrastructure, your architecture foundation, you're going to need to make sure that you have 10.8 or above, utilizing Pro. Esri has released a single user file geodatabase for being able to utilize the utility network, but that is for very small organizations, and definitely want to stress the single user. Another thing to think about is your data model. Do you already have it standardized One of the big things is that, the utility network data model is meant to be extended. Esri completely expects, and most organizations do that. It's really a base framework, but, being able to go in and add anything that is specific or unique for your organization. And of course, we definitely recommend, as you're going through that stage of the technological assessment, that you are looking at those third-party tools that are, already connecting to your geodatabase. We know that there's a lot of organizations out there that, that's the great thing about GIS, is how easily it integrates with those other systems. So just really, trying to make sure that whatever changes you're making, if it's, you just publish services and that's how they consume it, or hitting the database, that you're going ahead and aligning those. And then, of course, really the big thing is just making sure your organization is prepared to focus on the implementation. Providing training for those that are going to be editing. So, some of them may require ArcGIS Pro training, as well as utility network editing training, and making sure that, your organization is ready for a time commitment for implementing it. It's not something, that's easy to just kind of work on here or there when you have time. So we definitely recommend having that planned time and understanding that. And of course, looking at any time frames for implementations, because you're going to have to consider different versioning, and if there are any dependencies on those third-party systems, what that is going to mean for your implementation. So now I just want to focus on a couple of lessons learned. The biggest thing is, as we mentioned, definitely be familiar with ArcGIS Enterprise. You will be utilizing the platform, and so it's really just important to be familiar with the entire Esri stack. As I mentioned, once you're live, all the interaction with the data is going to be through services. So you're going to have your database, server, portal, network, and the biggest thing with that is just making sure that it's tuned for heavy geoprocessing services. So when you're going through that technological assessment, that will be one of the things that, not just making sure it can support your machines and users can support utilizing Pro, but making sure that the foundation is going to be able to support the geoprocessing. And so also, one thing to consider is going to be the versions, and keeping your version of ArcGIS Enterprise and Pro, as well as the UN, all in sync based on that functionality. And so one thing though is that, Esri has fortunately made some change in the deployment pattern, so that server rather than Pro is going to determine the version of the utility network. So that's just something to continue to look at and to consider there. And of course, as a new technology, you can expect continual updates and additional capabilities. So, Esri is continuing to provide updates to the data models, making changes. So definitely start tracking the roadmap and looking at the functionality, what versions are out there, just so you can plan accordingly for what you need for your organization, and also plan when and how you're going to do your utility network implementation in relation to that. And of course, just really take a look at your infrastructure. And one thing that Esri has also been indicating is that there are going to be the enterprise upgrades that may not impact the UN, where you can simply just stop the service, do your upgrade, restart it. But definitely plan ahead and talk to Esri, or read as much as you can on that as you're moving forward with the upgrades. And so now kind of moving on to some lessons learned in preparation. And the big thing to stress again is that the published data models that Esri is currently putting out are a really good starting point. But to reiterate, they're not considered final, and it's fully expected that an organization is going to extend it to meet your local needs. And so as part of the implementation planning, definitely consider the foundational templates as a way to prototype your data schema if you don't have any, or if you want to look at aligning it more with a database. And then The other most important thing that I mentioned you can start working on now is cleaning that source data. So Esri does have the data reviewer out there that you can deploy to identify errors and issues prior to migrating any data. Because as you do move into the utility network, there will be some errors that will prevent the features from loading in the first place, or may not, appear later when you're trying to calculate your sub networks. So that's why we recommend, at a minimum, start with your data, start to understand it, get it clean, really evaluate how and what's going to change as part of this implementation. One other thing, though, I do want to mention, I know I'm talking a lot about the magnitude, it's more than a data migration, but we've also seen similar success with some smaller organizations implementing the UN with their own staff. And with the organizations we've worked through in that process, really we're helping to coach and go through the planning and showing them, and then they're able to take it and run, and then we're providing some reach back support. So, definitely if your organization, if y'all are big do-it-yourselfers, there's, a lot of opportunity that with the right planning that, the implementation could be something that y'all take on either 100% on in-house or with a little bit of coaching. And of course, another thing to think about is the downtime. As you're planning for those system integrations, some organizations just really want a single cutover. So plan to, just test out the implementation in dedicated development environment. So then when you are ready to go live, you can, have a cutover that is going to minimize any data editing or timing. And also, as I mentioned before, one thing to look at is that test environment. So you can, not only looking at the data, but for the system integrations, testing them and making sure that they work. And then really moving into the implementation, just want to continue to stress that this should be a focused effort. Make sure that there are staff that are dedicated to the project as much as possible to really reduce risk, but also shorten those implementation timeframes. And really allow multiple pilots as you're going through the implementation. We definitely recommend at least 2, because that's really going to give you the opportunity to hash out the design and business rules. And then maybe even, as part of that pilot, use it for your end user training. You're definitely going to have to reconsider some workflows, and sometimes until they get it in their hands and start, working with things, you may not see that. And then of course, the editing process and versioning hierarchy in the UN is very different than what most people are used to. And the QA/QC, with it inherently being handled by the system in many places, it's important for them to understand that. And then of course, another important thing to consider is just like, as I mentioned, that downtime during the system. But before, there hasn't been a whole lot of documentation and communication about the utility network, but Esri is doing a fantastic job starting to update that information, in response to that community feedback. So improving the documentation and what they are communicating and putting out there. Because it is a challenge to stay current with all the developments. And another big thing that we have found is, in addition to the Esri technical support, there is a lot of information out there in the GeoNet community forums. And that's a really great resource to connect with other users that may be going through the same process or have already gone through that. And so, really though, a lot of the answers that are even being provided out there are coming directly from the Esri technical teams. So definitely, if you're not familiar, check it out. There's a lot of great information. And then also there's a lot of information being put out there just by Esri business partners like GIS Inc. So as I mentioned earlier, we do have some other webinars and some white papers that y'all can go check out for free, but there's lots and lots of information out there. So the implementation strategies that we want you to consider, getting started, looking at that solution deployment training, the data, the technology assessments, doing those up front as part, and then building your roadmap for that implementation. There are several tools out there to help during the migration. Esri has the data loading tools available. If your organization has FME, there's some workbenches, and then SSP Innovations has actually also developed a tool that will keep your geometric network and your utility network in sync, which a lot of larger organizations that have a lot of integrations are really excited about that, because it gives them the chance to really work in that testing environment and making sure that they're going to have a seamless transition and limited downtime when they go live, when feeding the data into all of those other systems that are very dependent on it. And of course, as I mentioned, some of the, there's a lot of quick ways to get started. The technical coaching, working with a group, helping to plan. There are jumpstart opportunities out there. So, really working through getting a sample of the solution, getting the information implemented, a small piece, so that, you can continue to add on that and continue to build. And then, the other piece is really just a full implementation support. So depending on your team's capabilities, your time frame, your resources, whether that is capacity of your team members or budgeting, there are lots of flexible options for you to get started in the implementation of the utility network. So it is something that, while I said it is a big transition, there are a lot of small ways that you can get started. So, biting off a little bit at a time. And just one last thing that I also wanted to mention, we know that there's the American Recovery Plan Act. One of the eligible uses is investing in water and sewer infrastructure. And so that can include projects such as the utility network implementation. So definitely, I know the cities and counties, there's money being funneled down. There's also a lot of additional stimulus funding going out to support infrastructure. So you may be able to find some of the funding mechanisms or sources that you may not have had within your organization. Some organizations are also looking at their capital improvement program, their CIP, for ways to put in their project. So, definitely work with the other team members, and, if this is something that you need to have assistance with a partner, those could be additional ways to get the funding to support that. Well, I really appreciate everybody joining the presentation this afternoon or this morning. I hope it was helpful to, just learn a little bit more about the utility network and some of the considerations, especially with the implementation and the migration piece. So does anybody have any questions?
All right. Yes, I want to say, by the way, this was an excellent presentation. It was extremely comprehensive. Every time I was thinking of something, you had an answer in one of the following slides. So you've covered a lot. And I know, a lot of the Shrug audience, may not have activities related to utilities, but certainly there are a good handful of cities and municipalities that are, considering this. So this is really good timing. Yeah, so I do have a question here. In a multi-user setting using branch versioning, is there a good way to keep individuals from editing default without being in a version?
Oh, that is a very good question. I do not personally have the answer to that. I know there's a lot of consideration depending on how everything's going to be set up for your organization. But if you would like to shoot me an email, my email address is up there. I will check with our utility network team and, respond and give you their recommendation or the things that need to be considered for that. That's
Okay.
a little bit past my piece when it comes into the implementation, but that is a great question. Definitely, if you want to send it, I'll get an answer for you quickly.
All right. Thank you. And Zach's got a question. Actually, he's got an answer. Yes, there is a QA/QC workflow with branch versioning. So we've got a response to that. And Wendy, if you feel free, or say Deirdre, who asked the question, if you want to reach back out to Wendy for further follow-up on that. So I recognize some of the names in the attendees here. Any of you guys have questions? Okay, there. If you do, there's the questions in your go-to interface. Okay. Well, if there are any more questions, oh, got one. Hold on. All right. I got a question for you while we're waiting for more questions to roll in. Wendy, where do you see the biggest speed bump or speed bumps in an implementation of the UN?
I think one of the biggest speed bumps that we have seen is one, training for users. Being able to make that migration to ArcGIS Pro and learn the nuances and the procedures for editing in the utility network, that's can be one of the biggest hurdles to get over. But of course, I think the other thing with that, not just the people side, is the data. And that's why we recommend, even if this may be a project that's maybe 2 years out, 3 years out for your organization, you can very easily start with the data analysis and giving you time to start, working on it, updating it. The other piece about the utility network is no matter how good your data is, just because you are going to a new network, you are
Mm-hmm.
going to have to make some changes to how you store your information and your assets. So starting early and looking at that and determining the appropriate workflows now, or what changes need to be made, or sometimes too it's just going to be creating an exception in the rules, so it doesn't flag those. That's going to be the other big thing. So as long as you take the time, one, to prepare your data, start looking at it now prior to moving into the implementation, and start preparing your users. Esri has some really great training out there on ArcGIS Pro. They also offer some utility network training. And a lot of organizations we've worked with have sent their users or utilizing that official utility network training prior to the implementation. So when they're going through the implementation process, they have that background information and knowledge.
And how do you see the uptake of it? I mean, do you see an uptick in the number of municipalities that are getting on board, or is it still a relatively slow adoption because it is that, as you referred to, as a paradigm change?
There's definitely a lot more interest in movement towards the implementation. There are a couple larger ones that are kind of biting the bullet and starting to do the full migration. But for those that, especially when it comes down to funding, if they're going to have to purchase additional infrastructure for their servers or their environment, or if it's something that they need help with that they're not able to complete in-house, and that's going to be the 2 to 3 years out, we're seeing a lot of requests, as I mentioned, for the data review or the technical assessment. So there's a lot of organizations that are out there that are really starting to make those initial moves so they can plan it out over the next couple of years. Because I mean, ultimately, the ArcMap's going to no longer be supported. You're going to have to be in Pro, and if you have the utility data and you want to be in the network, you're going to have to make that transition in the next, what is it, 4 or 5 years? I guess
Yeah,
2026 when
it'll be here
that
before
starts.
we know it. That's for sure.
Yeah, but definitely there are a lot of people out there that are starting to, dip their toes in the water and start moving forward. So definitely, talk to your neighbors in other jurisdictions, and of course, your Esri account manager can also make some connections to other similar organizations as well if you want to, I can get you in touch with a couple of people we've worked with, but, Esri will definitely have a very big selection of people they can connect you with who are starting to make those steps.
All right, thank you. And I do have another question from Zach. Did you experience any issues with asset types that were not part of the Esri's UN model?
I do know we had one of our customers that had a different asset type, but I think it was just one of the things they were able to go in and extend. But there's not been any issues or anything that is, they've had to completely stop and figure things out that I'm aware that our teams worked on.
Okay. Thank you. Well, this has been very informative, and hopefully all our listeners know that we're recording them. So I know it was a lot of information to digest, so it could be made available to you here shortly after the workshop ends. Are there any remaining questions? All right. If anybody has any questions, Wendy's got her email address up. Reach out to her. Wendy, thank you so much for making time and to not only just present this material, but to be a part of Shrug. We appreciate it.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and happy GIS